Okay, welcome to our lecture. Today's the first lecture of our summer session of 2020. Today we'll be talking about corporate power, the problems of governance and responsibility. So we'll give a short preview today about the power of big corporations and the issues of their governance. We'll look at the concept of limited liability, where it is, what it is, where it comes from, and we'll give you a bit of brief history of the very early corporations, the kind of emergence of the concept of limited liability, and look at the dawn of the modern corporation, which we'll be studying for the rest of this course. So, from corporate power to corporate governance. So when we think of large corporations, how big are they? Turns out in terms of revenue, one of the biggest corporations in the world is Walmart. Going back a few years ago now, Walmart had a revenue of around 351 billion US dollars. So how big is that in relation to, for example, sovereign nation states? Well, the revenue of Walmart is roughly the size of the gross domestic product of a small but very wealthy country like Sweden. Other big corporations are oil companies, ExxonMobil, very similar. And if we compare the revenue of ExxonMobil to a very wealthy oil producing country like Saudi Arabia, again, these two economies, the corporate economy and national economy, are of similar size. So we can extend this kind of exercise looking at Royal Dutch Shell, about the size of the GDP of Austria, British Petroleum, similar to the size of Denmark, General Motors, roughly the size of Greece, and so on. Toyota Corporate Motor, similar size to the GDP of Ireland, Chevron, we have Thailand, and so we can extend this list. Here's a German company, Daimler, then Daimler Chrysler, when these data were gathered. And again, the corporate economy of Daimler is roughly the size of Argentina. Okay, so when we start to think about the governance of corporations, we're talking about the governance of sometimes very huge, very powerful entities. And we're going to read in a couple of weeks Berlin Means, who argued, I'll read the quotation here, that the economic power in the hands of the few persons that control a giant corporation is a tremendous force which can harm or benefit multitudes of individuals, affect whole districts, shift the currents of trade, bring ruin to one community and prosperity to another. The organizations that they control have passed far beyond the realm of private enterprise. They have become nearly social institutions. So this is a very interesting quotation because, of course, in one sense, a corporation is a private enterprise. But here this private enterprise is so large, it's so powerful, both in the positive and maybe negative sense. It affects districts, it affects regions of the world, the countries which they come from, can shift trade, and it really has a big impact on society around it. So Berlin Means say, well, this kind of organization, in some sense, it's too big to be purely private. It's something that goes beyond being just private and has a social character. And the main issue for the course is then who controls this kind of corporation? what mechanisms do different, like the shareholders, stakeholders, or society at large, what mechanisms do they have to exert control on these large and powerful entities? Where and when are stakeholders affected by corporations? And of course, why should we care about this? So a very basic definition of our topic for this course, something you should remember, is that corporate governance concerns the structures of rights and responsibilities among the parties with a stake in the firm. Now, we're going to see in the course that there's going to be different definitions of corporate governance out there that are linked to different theories. I like this definition by one of my mentors, Masa Aoki, because I think it gives a fairly neutral and descriptive view. If we want to describe what is corporate governance, well, it's the rights and responsibilities of some different parties who are affected by corporations and may try to influence it. Now, that definition doesn't tell us how should corporations be governed. It's not a normative definition, but it's a fairly good descriptive definition that when we want to get into our subject, first we want to describe, what's going on. And from this flows these issues for the course. So if we want to kind of imagine this as a picture, we can imagine a corporation as having a kind of inside part in the white of this drawing, in the center of the key. Kind of in the inside part here, we have the owners of the corporation. It could be, a single owner, like a family, an entrepreneur. Usually what we mean are shareholders, which are a large number of people who own some shares in the company. These are the owners of the corporation, and they appoint and work together with a board of directors who sort of run the corporation. So we have the owners, we have the very top executives, the board of directors, then we have the different layers of management and the employees of the company. So when we think of a company, we're always going to have these groups of actors, or if you want to call them stakeholders. And then outside the corporation and the environment, of course, we have a lot of other different parties and groups that may influence the company, like the creditors, the suppliers. We have the auditors who certify the kind of flow of information. We have the government that regulates the companies. We have media that reports about companies and may affect sort of image and reputation. We have competitors in the same industry. We have customers, the general public, the conditions on the labor market, and so on. So in some sense, a narrow definition of corporate governance will usually start with the owners and directors of the company. It may get into the employees, and a kind of wider definition or extended definition will also think about relations to these different groups outside the firm. So this is a first picture that we can have. There's other pictures of stakeholders that you'll find, in which you have the firm, right, the kind of inside part of the organization. And here you'll see that owners are, an outside stakeholder of the group. Of course, most shareholders in a company are very big institutional investors or small individual shareholders who are not very involved in the companies that you own. So you can't think of a shareholder as being part of the inside part, because, of course, in the general meeting of shareholders, they can participate and make decisions inside the company. We could also think of owners as kind of being rather far away and kind of outside the company. So here we have a stakeholder map in which we have owners outside, kind of financial community, but we have a few other groups that we didn't have in the other diagram, like political groups, activists, NGOs, consumers and consumer advocates. We have employees, but also unions and trade associations, suppliers, competitors, and government. So there's no definitive list of all the groups that might be part of corporate governance, but these pictures might give you some kind of a flavor. So in this course, we're going, especially next week, to introduce you to some different perspectives, theoretical perspectives on the topic. The most widely used one that we'll start with is agency theory. It takes a somewhat narrow view of what is corporate governance because it really focuses very strongly on shareholders as principals and managers as the agents of those shareholders. So it's very much focused on the relation of the shareholders and the board and top management, and views this as a principal-agent problem. Some of you might remember agency theory from also the course Grundlagen der Personalpolitik, my other course, in which we were thinking of managers as principals or the company as a principal and employees as agents. And we had problems like information asymmetry and so on. So here we have a very similar thing, except we're focused on shareholders as the principals. And they sort of hire the managers to act on their behalf. Now, agency theory can be kind of extended, in which we should realize that this relation of shareholders and managers is not so simple and direct. It takes place in a social context. For example, we're going to take a lot of time in this course to look at the role of gatekeepers, who are like auditors, lawyers, ratings agencies, who are sort of informational intermediaries. They affect the flow of information and the degree of information asymmetry between shareholders and managers. And so we can kind of extend and get a richer, broader disciplinary type of view on the agency problem. So agency theory comes from microeconomics, but we can kind of enrich this by looking at finance, accounting, controlling, and so forth. And as we continue the class, we'll get more and more into a different type of theory, the stakeholder view, which gives a kind of wider social view about who corporations are accountable to. It focuses not just on the one relationship of shareholders and managers, but kind of balancing between broader stakeholder interests. And this concept will give us a kind of link between the part 1 of the class on corporate governance and the part 2 of the class, which will look at the topic of corporate social responsibility, which is a topic linked to sort of sustainability and social issues and how corporations can be accountable to society to do good. So we'll review these theories in depth next week. So what's the course about? Looking at a lot of different questions, like in what sense do shareholders own the firm, the differences between individual shareholders and so-called institutional shareholders. We'll look at why family ownership and other kinds of concentrated ownership persist in some countries but not others. We'll look at how does the supervisory board make sure that management's accountable. We'll ask, do corporations have responsibilities beyond the legal duties to owners? Why do firms voluntarily engage in CSR type of programs? Does it pay for companies to be good? Is there a business case for being sustainable? And what happens when corporations fail to do that? What are the consequences of their irresponsibility? Defines the corporation in a legal sense as a person. Corporation is an entity apart from its members It enjoys certain rights in the same way a person might enjoy rights. The main purpose of a corporation is to allow small investors to invest money into that entity, into the company, without being held liable for the company's debts. This is in German beschränkte Haftung. So a key question that flows from this is that will the company behave responsibly if no person, in the sense of a biological person, is actually fully responsible for its debts? So we're going to see that early corporations were actually associated with speculation, even fraud, and in the early days of corporations, there was fairly few protections from shareholders. So unlike a partnership where you have liability of the partners, the innovation of limiting liability made it possible. It facilitated the investment of money into corporations on a much larger scale than before. Why? Well, for the first time, then, small individual shareholders could pool together their money and amass it into much larger amounts. And then having stock markets made it easier for those individuals who just owned a small stake in the company to buy or sell their shares in the market. It made ownership easier to trade and increased liquidity, which also made it much more attractive for middle-class people or people with small savings to invest some of that savings into corporations. So again, a key question in our reading of this week is in Bakan's book, takes the concept of legal personhood and explores this much future. So if the corporation is legally a person, it enjoys rights, it's an entity apart from its members. He asks in the book, what's the nature of this person? Well, we're going to see today and throughout the class that the nature of the corporation is that at least certain large corporations have tremendous power. We already introduced you to the large size of the modern corporation. And with this size comes power. What do we mean actually by the power of corporations? One aspect is the social decision-making power. So corporations organize things in a certain way. They affect the choices that we have in markets. They affect things like, if you think of Google as a corporation, well, its algorithms that people use have a large social influence. These algorithms make decisions, they steer us to certain kind of information away from other kinds of information. So they frame a lot of how we make decisions. So corporations, are kind of part of the cultural fabric of capitalist societies. They affect social decision making. Corporations also have market power, so they influence prices, what's available, the supply and demand of what we can buy, and the kinds of trade-offs that we're going to make in our market decisions. And corporations also can wield a lot of political power through lobbying, through political donations, and it's a way in which that economic power can translate into power and influence in other spheres. So these different kinds of power that corporations, and particularly large corporations, may have raise new issues about, raise new questions about responsibility. In what ways are corporations accountable to society? Do they have some particular kinds of responsibilities when they wield these different kinds of power that I mentioned just now? So a good starting place to think about this topic is, of course, going back to economic theory and the familiar concept of externality. So corporations may become like externalizing machines, entities in which, in the pursuit of profit, will be fairly content to externalize costs of their activity onto third parties. So an externality occurs when the economic activity of a company causes costs that are external, or can also be benefits to external third parties who don't directly affect the transaction or are not involved in the decision making. So producers and consumers in a market may not bear all the costs or do not get all the benefits of their economic activity. So for example, manufacturing that causes air pollution imposes costs on others, whereas planting forests, might improve water quality of areas around. So externalities can be, usually we think of them as negative externalities. They can also be positive externalities. So this is a way to understand how corporate activity may spill over and have wider effects on the society around them. And this raises, or one way to think about this issue is then the relation between public interest and private interest. So if a corporation is granted the privilege of limited liability, so the government, the public, grants corporations this privilege and gives them rights as if they're like a legal, as if they're a person, then what responsibilities does this corporate entity have towards society? And we're going to see that in different times and in different countries, there's different answers to these questions. Like, is the corporation a purely private association of shareholders? Like some of us get together, we say voluntarily, oh, let's start a company, we put our money in, we do the paperwork, we create the corporate entity with the limited liability. And we could think of this as our private creation, like it's our business, and that's it. But another way to think is to say, or to ask whether there's a kind of public interest in that entity, the kinds of social decisions as it's made. Because after all, the corporation has been granted limited liability. Now, you and I, as biological individuals, don't have limited liability. Right? So if we do damage to third parties and that damage exceeds the amount of money that we have in the bank, we're held liable for those debts or for that kind of damage that we do. And a corporation can be held liable, but the limited liability is the limitation of the liability of the shareholders who invest their money. So you put 1,000 euros in, that limits your liability to that 1,000 euros, and you don't have ultimate responsibility for what the corporation does. The corporation is still liable, but remember that the corporation itself, as a legal person, is not a biological person. So there's some difference here. So we're going to see these old debates about the nature of the company as being something that's private or something that's a kind of a public entity. And if we translate this debate into modern times, so there was, these are debates about profit maximization versus social wealth creation, shareholder rights versus stakeholder involvement, or what's the role of corporate social responsibility. Part 3. Let's look at a brief history of the earliest corporations to understand where corporations actually come from. The earliest type of modern corporations come really from the age of imperialism, so around 1600 to the period 1750. This was the period of European exploration, expansion of trade with India, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. It was a time of slave trade in Africa, of new relations with the Americas. It was a time when European powers were expanding and becoming imperialist nations. In this context, corporations emerged as trading corporations. A corporation might be established usually for a particular sea voyage. So imagine sailing ships sailing to India with goods to trade. And these were very risky undertakings, physically risky. It was quite likely there would be disease, the death of a crew. Cargo could be taken by pirates. It could be fraud, and different things could happen along the journey. So these were very risky ventures. And corporations were established as politically granted monopolies to organize trade with a particular area. I'll explain this now. So a famous example of this was the East India Company. The East India Company was set up by a petition to Queen Elizabeth I, you may know. They petitioned the Queen to set up a special trading company between England and the East Indies. Queen Elizabeth gave the East India Company a monopoly on trade for 15 years, starting in 1600, and it took them some time to get going, to get organized, and the first venture of the East India Company, the first expedition, returned in 1603. All 5 ships came back, and they brought 500 tons of pepper. This was a success and led to further voyages, which were successful and highly profitable, so that by 1620, the East India Company was operating a convoy of 30 to 40 ships. These ships were quite large. They were heavily armed with cannons and protection. And the kind of trades they made got more complex. So they would go and make a sort of series of trades during the voyage. They might bring lead or tin, trade these for textiles, then trade those textiles for spices or tea in another area. And so the kind of complexity of the flow of goods, the logistics of the mission, required a larger scale and more professional management that was undertaken by not just the shareholders of the company, but by an appointed group of directors. It was a separate body, a separate group of people from the shareholders. Politics was still very involved in the East India Company, and in 1767, the company actually was granted control of the territory of Bengal by Parliament. The East India Company essentially became a kind of administrative arm of the imperial state and was referred to as an empire within an empire. So by 1813, government, the English government, finally relinquished its monopoly on trade and eventually closed them down altogether. But there was a period of time in which they were very much part of the state. So here's a interesting photograph in the British Library of the East India Company, and you can see it looks like an army, like a military organization, which it very much was, because they actually controlled and administered the territory with which they're trading as part of the British Empire. So we find an even more famous example in the Netherlands, in the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company was established in 1602, so very much around the same time. The Netherlands granted it a monopoly to carry out its colonial activities in Asia. It's often referred to as the first multinational corporation in the world. Its claim to fame is certainly that it was the first company to issue stock. So the East India Company itself was set up by 6 chambers of commerce in the cities of Amsterdam, Delft, Rotterdam, and other places, but the headquarters of the company was actually in Java. They had a similar trajectory of expansion. So by 1669, it was the largest private company in the world. It controlled over 150 merchant sailing ships, 40 warships, had 50,000 employees, including a private army of 10,000 soldiers. It was a very lucrative business, so they made a quite large dividend payment to its shareholders, and their success continued over a very long period of time until they finally got into financial trouble and were dissolved nearly 200 years later in 1798. So here we see from the archives a copy of the oldest corporate share. So we can see this pattern in other areas and also in other types of business than trading company. Another famous trading company was the South Sea Company, which had the monopoly of trade between England and the sort of Spanish America. It was also involved in buying a lot of government debt, bonds after wartime. And the South Sea Company became famous case of fraud. So it was more of this case of engaging in financial speculations. Other corporations were set up, for example, to build canals. In the UK, 165 canal acts were submitted to Parliament. So if you wanted to make a canal to connect 2 bodies of water, improve the flow of shipping, facilitate trade, well, the kind of act of building a canal is quite technically complex. It takes a long period of time, takes a lot of capital that needs to be pooled together. And there's a kind of public interest in building a canal, having this infrastructure. So what you would do is you would go to Parliament and you would ask them to grant limited liability for the company which was set up for the purpose of building a canal, the same way the East India Company was set up for the purpose of trading with a certain part of the world. And this pattern continued into the colonies in the United States, and then in the early history of the United States. There was a big tradition then of setting up chartered corporations. Charter refers to the government granting the charter to set up the corporation. A very famous early chartered corporation is Harvard University. But this model of setting up corporations was used in banks. It was also used in churches, canals, building roads, or even sometimes like a new town would be set up that the municipality itself would be a chartered corporation. The Bank of North America, later Bank of America, is a famous example. So moving on to our next part, I want to get on to the dawn of the modern corporation and really what is corporate governance. And to do that, it's good to begin with the classic. Many of you were commenting on this in the reading. Adam Smith. Adam Smith is a famous theorist and advocate for the market, the invisible hand, private enterprise. But it's quite interesting that he was a very strong critic of the corporation. For him, he said, well, these corporations like the East India Company were based on monopoly. not based on free trade, not based on the invisible hand of competition. They're instruments of monopoly. So this was the first reason that he didn't like corporations of his time. He also made some very astute observations, which I think anticipated a lot of the contemporary corporate governance discussion, and it's interesting to read these quotes because they seem very modern. He said one problem with giving limited liability to shareholders is that it will kind of feed the lack of knowledge by those owners. He said corporate shareholders seldom pretend to understand anything of the business of the company. And when the spirit of faction happens to prevail amongst them, they give themselves no trouble about it, but receive contentedly half-yearly or yearly dividends as the directors think proper to make them. So what's he trying to say? He said, well, basically when we buy stock of a company, yeah, we know, we have an intuition, it's a good company, a good business, but we don't deeply understand the business. We're kind of guessing, it's in a hot field, it's growing. So we buy some shares, and it doesn't matter that we're not an expert or that we wouldn't be able to run the businesses of ourselves. So pretty much we buy the share, and then we kind of sit back, we wait, and hope that dividends come in the mail. So the owners themselves are fairly ignorant. And this ignorance can lead to the second problem, the possibility of negligence by the professional managers who themselves are not owners, who don't own the company, but they're appointed to run it. So Smith famously said, being the managers of other people's money than their own, it cannot well be expected that they would watch over it with the same anxious vigilance with which the partners of a private copartnery frequently watch over their own. Like the stewards of a rich man, they consider attention to small matters as not for their master's honor, and very easily give themselves to dispensation for having it. Negligence and profusion therefore must prevail, more or less, in the management of such a company. Without an exclusive privilege, corporations have commonly mismanaged the trade. With an exclusive privilege, they have both mismanaged and confined it. So there's a few things going on in this quote. The thing I want you to notice most directly is that he points out that the assets of the company that the manager is managing don't belong to them. It's other people's money invested in the corporation. And he's saying here that if it's not their money, they're not going to watch over it in the same way. So he's making a kind of connection here to the kind of the interest of the managers, their material interest, but also the kind of like moral vigilance with which they approach their job. So he's saying that by having money which is not your own, it's essentially going to corrupt your character or corrupt your ethos to some certain extent. So he says not just that it's likely, he says negligence must prevail. So he was very certain that this cannot end well, this corporation, because the management will never behave as a true owner. And the last part of the quote, when he talks about exclusive privilege, here he's talking about the corporations of his time being this monopolies. So he's saying they're bad even if they're not a monopoly, but if you combined monopoly with other people's money, this is going to be really bad, according to Adam Smith. So we'll see that many other people around that time and in the next century, as corporations developed, when it was being debated to make the first corporate laws in the 19th century, many of the same arguments were still around. Lord Brougham and the House of Lords said that limited liability was contrary to the whole genius and spirit of English law. It will relax that care and vigilance which every partner ought to keep over his association and give license to every species of fraud. So he's saying if you make it easier for people to get limited liability, it will make things too relaxed. It will basically have this kind of corrupting effect and lead people to not pay attention and really make it very easy to have corruption and scandals. So he viewed it as being a kind of downgrade from the partnership, which was well established in English law. The letter to the Banking Association stated that nothing should be done by the legislature to weaken the motives for personal industry, economy, and thrift. The moral effect of joint stock corporations for mercantile objects, which are properly within the compass of individual exertion, is bad. They introduce a pace of patient labor and moderate expectations, ambitious hopes, and the habit of gambling in shares. So here, again, the argument is a moral one, that there's something about limiting liability which sends the signal that you don't have to take care. Instead of being patient and moderate, we become kind of gamblers. We invest a little bit, we see what happens, our ambition gets very big, but we're not taking the same care as if we have everything to lose. So there's a kind of moral argument here that corporations would have a kind of negative effect. Nonetheless, the critics of the corporation lost out at this time. And we see that there was a shift in the politics of the corporation from this, what's called concession system, to a normative system. This is an important thing to understand. The concession system is what I described to you earlier, that to set up a corporation, you had to petition Parliament. So a corporation could only be set up by a specific act of Parliament for that corporation, right? Because it was a special privilege granted if large amounts of capital were required. And this is key, that the purpose of the corporation was deemed in the public interest. So it was something, again, we need a canal, we need to set up a trade with a new area of the world. These are kind of projects which there's a kind of common public interest in. And for this purpose, he would go to Parliament, and they'd make a special law to set up a particular company. Yeah? So at this time, if you were an ordinary industrial company manufacturing items, you wouldn't be a corporation. You'd just be a partnership. It was your private business. And corporations were something that had a bigger scale, but also this public interest element. But corporations became very successful. It became popular. We saw it extended from trade to canals. So more and more types of activities were being organized as corporations. And eventually, in the mid-19th century, one country after the next would switch to what's called a normative system of incorporation, which meant that anybody could set up a corporation without going to Parliament, but just if you follow certain rules and norms of incorporation. So you fill out your paperwork, you set it up, you could become a corporation, but at this first time it didn't include limited liability. It was just to set up the company as an entity. And a few years later, in England in 1856, the Joint Stock Companies Act granted to shareholders of any corporation limited liability for the company's debts. So this in 1856 is the first time anywhere in the world you could set up a corporation freely without getting a special act of Parliament. So this is called a normative system of incorporation. So when we're talking about the modern corporation, we're talking about this kind of normative system. And despite the public origins of what a corporation was in the beginning, the corporation became increasingly a vehicle for private interests. Anybody could set up a corporation to do just about anything. Just had to file the paperwork. So the corporate form started to spread, and it started to be used for more industrial corporations, for manufacturing, and it helped those manufacturing corporations also to bring together larger amounts of capital to let industry grow, to let it become more technologically sophisticated, more capital intensive. And there was a kind of good fortune of this that corporate form came along and co-evolved with the expansion of stock markets. The stock markets, again, were something that have a origin more in, state finance, but more and more stock markets grew to invest in industrial companies, and you find the emergence of professional investors who were engaging in the buying and selling of stock, and you see more middle class, bourgeois, well-to-do persons become involved in the economy in a different way by investing their savings into the stock market. So what I'd like you to notice so far in talking about this history of the corporation is that there's a kind of tension or ambivalence about the nature of the corporation and its governance, right? And different ways in which we might think about what is a corporation, what's the role of the public interest in it. And one way to think of this, that we're going to talk about both of these more next week, but the first view is that the company is really a kind of private association. So a corporation or company, its interests are those of their members, meaning the shareholders. A company is something people set up voluntarily. No one makes you buy shares in the stock market. It's something that you engage in by your choice. And it's similar to any kind of contract that we might have. The corporation here should be the realm of a kind of private ordering. Issues of stakeholders and the impact on society are kind of outside of the company. The government can regulate that, but society as a whole and its stakeholders don't really have any role in corporate governance here. So corporations may choose to do good things, to be responsible, but only in as much as there's a business case for doing it. So you might be ecological, because it makes good business sense and it serves the kind of interest of the shareholders. So this is a view, corporation as a private association. A different view would see the company as something like an entity, an entity that has a kind of constitutional order. So there's a nice word for this in German, Unternehmensverfassung. We also talk about the Betriebsverfassung, and the law of works councils talks about the Betriebsverfassungsgesetz. So we can think of a company as having a kind of constitutional order. The company is an entity that has an interest in itself, which is separate from any of its members. So the company has its own set of interests, which are defined and regulated by the public. So here we have the idea that a corporation is something like a political system in which there needs to be checks and balances by the different functions of the company, and stakeholders are represented inside the company. So for example, we have employee representation, we have representation of shareholders on the board, and we have a kind of mini political structure in which these different groups try to come to some kind of understanding. And here, the responsibilities of a company are something like citizenship. They're a political duty. They're something that's not just dependent on the profit motive, but there's something that companies must do to maintain their legitimacy in the society. So we're coming to the end of our first session. What to remember and review. Please be sure you understand the concept of limited liability, whose liability is limited, and why this was so important for corporations growing and becoming so powerful as they are today. It's good in this context to remember the two ethical arguments outlined by Adam Smith and others against limited liability. So why might this not be a good thing? This is going to help us understand some of the problems and challenges for corporate governance. And you should review these two approaches to the public interest regarding the corporation, whether we think of a corporation as a private entity or something has a public character to it. So I look forward to meeting all of you and discussing these issues in our first tutorial session. I'd also like to please remind you to do your reading and to engage in the discussion that we're having online on Perusal, a new interactive e-reading software platform that we're using for the first time. I'm very happy and encouraged by the first discussions there. So thanks to all the students who are posting questions and comments, answering other students' questions, and I look forward to continuing that with you and picking up on these comments and questions in the first tutorial sessions that we're having this week. Next week, we'll go on to the theory part of the course. We'll look at agency theory and stakeholder theory. Thank you very much.